Deep within the Brazilian Amazon lies one of archaeology's most haunting mysteries. In 1925, a renowned British explorer vanished while searching for a lost civilization, leaving behind only cryptic messages and impossible evidence that continues to baffle investigators nearly a century later. But first, subscribe to be part of our community seeking the truth. It was May 29, 1925, in the remote wilderness of the Mato Grosso region, where the endless green canopy of the Amazon rainforest stretches beyond the horizon like a living ocean. The air hung thick with humidity and the constant drone of insects, while somewhere in this vast expanse, Colonel Percy Harrison Fawcett prepared for what would become his final expedition into the unknown. Fawcett was no ordinary explorer. The 57-year-old British surveyor had spent decades mapping the most dangerous regions of South America for the Royal Geographical Society. His weathered face bore the scars of countless jungle encounters, and his piercing blue eyes held the intensity of a man obsessed with solving one of history's greatest archaeological puzzles. For years, Fawcett had been consumed by reports of a magnificent lost city hidden deep within the Brazilian interior. He called it simply Z, a place he believed rivaled the great civilizations of Egypt and Mesopotamia. Ancient Portuguese documents spoke of towering stone structures, elaborate temples, and advanced engineering that seemed impossible for the region's indigenous peoples to have constructed. The expedition consisted of 3 men: Fawcett himself, his 21-year-old son Jack, and Jack's best friend, Raleigh Rimal. Both young men possessed the athletic build and adventurous spirit necessary for such a perilous journey. Jack shared his father's strong jawline and determined expression, while Rimal, slightly shorter but equally robust, had proven his courage during their preparations. Their last confirmed location was the remote outpost of Cuicuro, where local Kalapalo tribesmen watched the 3 white men disappear into the forest with an unusual mixture of fear and resignation. The tribal chief, an elderly man named Aloik, had reportedly tried to dissuade them from continuing eastward, speaking in broken Portuguese about places where the forest dreams and stone spirits walk. What made Aloik's warnings particularly disturbing was their specificity. He described locations the expedition planned to visit with uncanny accuracy, despite claiming his people never ventured into those regions. When pressed for details, the chief would only repeat that some areas of the jungle existed between the world of the living and the world of shadows. The expedition's radio equipment maintained contact with the outside world for the first 2 weeks of June. Fawcett's transmitted messages grew increasingly cryptic as they ventured deeper into uncharted territory. His final communication, received on June 13th, contained a single disturbing line: "The ruins are not what they appear to be. The stones remember." Search parties dispatched by the Royal Geographical Society found evidence that challenged every assumption about the expedition's fate. At what should have been their 3rd campsite, investigators discovered Fawcett's compass and surveying equipment arranged in a perfect spiral pattern around a cold fire pit. The arrangement was so precise it appeared deliberate, yet none of the 3 men possessed the mathematical knowledge to create such complex geometric formations. More unsettling were the markings found carved into nearby trees. The symbols bore no resemblance to any known indigenous writing system, yet they appeared fresh despite being discovered months after the expedition's disappearance. Local guides refused to approach the carved trees, claiming they hurt the eyes to look upon and caused intense headaches in anyone who stared too long. The search team's photographer, a pragmatic man named Harrison Mills, attempted to document the strange symbols. When his film was developed weeks later in Sao Paulo, the images showed not the carved markings he had photographed, but instead revealed glimpses of massive stone structures that seemed to shift and change between frames. The negatives themselves bore scorch marks that had no logical explanation. Subsequent expeditions uncovered increasingly bizarre evidence. a Swiss anthropologist named Klaus Brenner discovered what appeared to be Jack Fawcett's journal buried beneath the roots of a massive cecropia tree. The final entries described encounters with guardians who possessed an intimate knowledge of the expedition's purpose and destination. According to the journal, these guardians were not indigenous people, but something far more ancient. They appeared human from a distance, but moved with an unnatural fluidity that suggested their bodies operated according to different physical laws. Jack's handwriting became increasingly erratic as he described their hollow voices and eyes that reflected scenes from places that should not exist. The most disturbing entry, dated 3 days after the expedition's last radio contact, described the discovery of the city Fawcett had spent his life seeking. But rather than the archaeological triumph he had envisioned, Jack wrote of structures that seemed to exist partially in their reality and partially in some other dimension entirely. The buildings appeared solid during daylight hours but became translucent at dusk, revealing glimpses of vast chambers filled with geometric patterns that induced severe vertigo in anyone who observed them directly. The city's central plaza contained a series of stone monoliths that hummed with a low frequency that could be felt in the bones rather than heard. Fawcett himself had become obsessed with these monoliths, spending hours studying their surfaces and taking measurements with instruments that began producing impossible readings. His compass spun wildly in their presence, while his altimeter showed elevations that placed them simultaneously at sea level and several thousand feet above their actual position. The journal's final legible entry described Fawcett's decision to enter the largest structure alone, despite his son's protests. Jack wrote that his father had been changed by prolonged exposure to the city, speaking of responsibilities to preserve the threshold and maintain the balance between what is and what waits. When morning came, Percy Fawcett had vanished. The structure he had entered appeared solid and impenetrable, with no visible entrances or windows. Jack and Rymel spent 2 days searching for any way inside, but the building's surface remained smooth and unbroken, as if it had been carved from a single, massive stone. The journal entries ended abruptly, mid-sentence, with Jack describing strange lights appearing in the jungle around their camp. The final words were barely legible. "They are not lights. They are eyes. The forest is watching, and it sees everything we have done." Brazilian authorities launched the most extensive search operation in the Amazon's recorded history. Military units, indigenous trackers, and international volunteers combed thousands of square miles of jungle, following every possible route the expedition might have taken. What they discovered defied rational explanation. Multiple search teams reported finding camps that matched the expedition's equipment and supplies, but these sites appeared in locations that would have been impossible for the 3 men to reach given their known timeline and route. Some camps showed signs of recent occupation, despite being discovered months after the disappearance, while others appeared to have been abandoned for decades. The most disturbing discovery came from a Brazilian army unit led by Captain Eduardo Santos. Deep in the Xingu River basin, his men found a clearing where the vegetation had been arranged in the same spiral pattern as the equipment at the earlier campsite. At the center of this formation sat 3 wooden crosses bearing the names P. Fawcett, and R. Rymel. The crosses were carved from a type of wood that did not exist in the region and bore dates of death that preceded the expedition's departure by several years. When the crosses were disturbed, the men reported hearing what sounded like distant voices speaking in English, though no words could be clearly distinguished. Captain Santos ordered his men to remove the crosses for further examination, but when they returned to the clearing the following morning, the markers had been replaced with identical copies. This pattern continued for 3 consecutive days, with new crosses appearing each time the previous ones were removed, until Santos finally ordered his unit to abandon the site entirely. Years later, anthropologists studying the region's indigenous cultures uncovered oral traditions that seemed to reference the Fawcett expedition with impossible accuracy. The Kalapalo people possessed detailed songs describing the arrival of 3 white men seeking the place where time bends, despite claiming they had never encountered Europeans before Portuguese traders arrived in the 1800s. These songs described events that matched the expedition's known activities with disturbing precision, including references to the father who walks between worlds and the sons who call to the forest, but receive no answer. Most unsettling was the song's conclusion, which spoke of the 3 men as guardians of the threshold who would return when the barriers weaken. Modern technology has only deepened the mystery surrounding Fawcett's disappearance. Satellite imagery of the regions he explored reveals geometric formations in the jungle canopy that appear artificial but show no signs of human construction. These patterns become visible only from specific altitudes and angles, suggesting they were designed to be observed from above by viewers possessing precise knowledge of their location. Ground-penetrating radar surveys have detected massive stone structures buried beneath the forest floor in areas that match Fawcett's planned route. However, excavation attempts have yielded nothing but undisturbed soil and root systems, despite the radar signatures remaining consistent across multiple surveys conducted decades apart. The most recent expedition to search for evidence of Fawcett's fate was organized by the Brazilian National Geographic Society in 2005. Using GPS coordinates derived from his final radio transmissions, the team located what appeared to be the remnants of the lost city that had consumed the explorer's final years. The site consisted of partially buried stone foundations arranged in patterns that seemed to shift depending on the observer's position. Photographs taken from different angles showed the same structures in completely different configurations, as if the ruins existed in a state of constant flux. Team members reported experiencing severe disorientation when attempting to map the site, with compass readings changing dramatically within the span of minutes. Digital cameras malfunctioned consistently, producing images that showed the ruins as they appeared during daylight hours, even when photographs were taken at night. The expedition's final report, classified by Brazilian authorities and never publicly released, allegedly contained evidence that Colonel Fawcett had not simply disappeared, but had undergone some form of transformation that allowed him to exist simultaneously in multiple dimensions. Witnesses who claimed to have seen portions of the report described photographs showing a figure resembling the elderly explorer standing among the ruins, but appearing translucent and somehow disconnected from the surrounding environment. What do you think really happened to Percy Fawcett and his companions in that remote corner of the Amazon? Subscribe to explore more cases where the line between exploration and the supernatural becomes impossibly blurred.